Welcome, everyone, to The Work and Meditation, a podcast devoted to conversations with people engaged in the fourth way Gurdjieff work, the work of inner Christianity, or simply esoteric Christianity, and who also have a connection to a meditation practice, whether it's centering prayer or otherwise. Today, we have a very special guest, Mr. Jonathan Steele, who serves as devotional minister at the Church of Conscious Harmony in Austin, Texas. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Roland. Glad to be here.
Well, Jonathan, I thought it would be great to hear about your role at Church of Conscious Harmony to start out with, because CCH as an institution is so relevant to the topics that we cover on this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So, devotion, God devotion, is the language we use around here, being central to all of the offerings at the church. I would say my role holds the heart of that on behalf of the community. So practically speaking, I do the lion's share of the teaching in our Sunday devotional services that are contemplative in nature. Weave silence and stillness and chant. And then there's a teaching component that for me feels more like a retreat than a traditional, what someone might have experienced in other churches in terms of a sermon or teaching. And I do that about halftime on our Wednesday contemplative services. And then a really large part of what I do is spiritual direction or spiritual companioning, meeting one-on-one with people and sharing what's central here at the church, which is the spiritual journey through the practices and lens of the inner work of Christianity as well as contemplative Christianity, as articulated by various teachers, but in the modern day and age, Thomas Keating, one of my teachers, Cynthia Bourgeot, who has probably become more influential here vicariously through my presence, and it's important for me to honor her as a teacher, one of my teachers. So spiritual direction, and then what you might consider pastoral care or counseling for people in crisis, which is often what opens the door to recognizing the need for, let's say, meditation or being conscious of the spiritual journey. So I'm very privileged and blessed to be here in a community where I get to talk about what matters most to me, which is the spiritual journey. Yeah.
When I know that blesses people at CCH at the church as well, and I'm one of them. I was drawn to come to CCH because of its connection with centering prayer and really a spiritual crisis in my own life about 5 years ago, and I'm so grateful for all the people there and how you've contributed so greatly. I wanted to find out a little bit about your educational background, because you studied to go into the ministry, and then you had a connection with the Episcopal Church as well. And I think it would be interesting to hear about your journey there from education to how you came into the ministry in a professional way.
Sure. I was on a track in my undergraduate education, which I have a Bachelor of Science in International Business. Business administration with an emphasis, I think, or concentration in international business. I was on a track to follow Dad's footsteps and work in the corporate world, and was happy to do that. And I had a series of spiritual awakenings during that time, which was the beginning of the path into ministry and discerning a call. My master's was done at a seminary, non-denominational seminary called Fuller Theological Seminary, after I was already working as a pastor and church planter. So starting communities, churches. And I was pursuing that degree not for a credential at the time. It wasn't a traditional Master's of Divinity that is usually the typical route to pastoral work in a church setting. So I set it down for a while until I had enough crisis in my own life and had started a meditation practice and was doing some psychological work. And I realized that included 12-step influence and recovery circles, men's work, those kinds of things, learning to tell the truth on myself or to myself about some things that I had kept pretty under wraps psychologically. And so I realized through Fuller I could do an emphasis in recovery ministry, which included this invitation to walk my own spiritual path as I took a lot of information in that was grounded in experience. So family systems theory and 12 steps, obviously, pastoral care and abuse. Those kinds of topics were relevant. Eventually, in what I mentioned, recognizing the need for some ground in my own heart being, I had outsourced a lot of wisdom to mentors and realized I needed to stand on my own ground in some ways. And that was also part of the impetus to begin a daily meditation practice, which led me to finding centering prayer and the teaching of Cynthia Bourgeault. And so I kind of got hooked into both centering prayer and the work of inner Christianity, or the fourth way, through her influence. And go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask when you first encountered her work.
I was actually sitting in the therapy office of my spiritual father and friend and mentor at the time, and his decades-long therapist was talking about her experience with noetic science and exploration. And she had been married to a minister, divorced, and she would say that my friend had saved her faith because he was not completely full of it and still trying to follow a Christian path. And she said, "Hey, you should check out Cynthia Bourgeault," speaking to the two of us. And I looked her up. This was in probably 2000, around 2010. I was into Richard Rohr and already into some contemplative teachers in the Christian tradition. Thomas Merton was a gateway drug, his writings. And I looked up some stuff around Cynthia, and at the time, for me, she was too, from a judgment, too theologically out there. But I purchased a book that she had written called Down the Road, fast forward a couple of years. I finally picked up a book of hers, so probably around 2013, The Trinity and the Law of Three. And I opened it up, tried to read it, and it was, what is she talking about? I didn't have enough, let's say, harmonization in my own being to really be with some of the terminology. It was a little off-putting, honestly. But one of the words that she introduced, or names that I wasn't familiar with, was Gurdjieff. And I was drawn to that. The work term of magnetic center was online for me. This kind of pull towards a deeper seeking. And I was living in Valencia, Spain at the time. I was pastoring, leading a church there. And I'm walking down the street where concerts or events may be advertised on an urban wall, flyers. And I see a photo or an image of this man who was Gurdjieff. It's an image of him with a little number to call, and found myself in an interview with a work group teacher. And next thing I knew, I was in weekly movements, which is one of the ways or one of the forms or modalities of transformation that really works on an individual within a group that Gurdjieff and others introduced. So that was the beginning of the end for me. I had found something I had been looking for that I didn't know was missing.
You know, and part of what we want to do here is education or provide education to people that maybe don't know a lot about the work or maybe have heard something about it. But, you know, it's a big topic. And I asked Robin in the first episode, Robin, tell us what the work is. And I could ask you the same thing, but maybe this is another way of asking it. When you're on an airplane sitting next to somebody and they ask you what you do and they say, well, what's the work of inner Christianity? How would you respond to that question?
Ooh, yeah. Well, I would say that a lot of times Gurdjieff is credited with introducing the work of inner Christianity to the West. But, you know, in antiquity, the Western traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, were held as a unity in some ways. We have forgotten our shared roots. Part of what, and so even previous to the birth, let's say, historically, of Jesus of Nazareth, there, as a friend of mine who's taken groups to Egypt for a long time, takes devoted Christians to see these engravings of the Immaculate Conception thousands of years before the birth of Christ, to recognize that, and maybe using Jung's language of the collective unconscious, it's all been there, waiting to be embodied and birthed and stewarded in our traditions. But so the work of inner Christianity finds its genesis in antiquity, I would say. And it's really the esoteric contemplative dimension in some ways of what or has needed to arise or be stewarded at the neglect of the contemplative tradition, with so much, let's say, overemphasis on the exoteric form or structure. We might think of it as, to use a metaphor from Jesus, of a wineskin. I've been actually with someone who's had a canvas or really leather canteen in Spain on pilgrimage that was filled with wine. And, you know, if that were dried out, it would crust and it wouldn't remain malleable. And so Jesus talks about needing new wineskins to hold the living element of the tradition. And I would think of the work of inner Christianity as being those of us that feel called to stay connected with that inner dimension of the teachings of Christ, and discover authentic forms or wineskins of where that can be expressed in community. But it's not necessarily always done in public view. Now, it can be in exoteric forms of what we might think of as a church, for example. But a lot of the inner work of Christianity has been kept necessarily underground through this belief that if we're all interconnected and one at the end of the day, that keeping these teachings alive and these practices will make us into something that can be of service in the world, whether we're pointing directly at the tradition or not. We're holding these teachings that have been passed down a lot of times in a tradition of oral transmission rather than just in written form.
Yeah, that's
So,
one.
so that wasn't an airplane answer. That was if I knew that there was a sincere seeker next to me, or someone who is really interested in the journey. That was a mouthful. But
Well, no, it's good, and I think what you were really getting at is trying to say, okay, we do have some specific faith traditions, but it may be that we have seen those only through the lens of the exoteric presentation, and there's more to it really that meets the eye, and maybe if we do dig a little deeper, then this is something that I mentioned to Marianne, that I love the work in the sense that it's designed to create a language where we can relate to people of other faith traditions, but still have constructive dialogue about spiritual matters.
yes, and the beautiful thing about the work itself, the work of inner Christianity, especially as Gurdjieff presented it, he discovered the fourth way on his travels, and then presented it with these particular forms that were relevant to Westerners, which is an example of needing to find the new wineskin that would speak to people. And he had his own delivery, own personality, but there was a cycle eventually in second generation of students. There was more explicit integration of psychology. And so the nice thing, just to echo what you're saying, is with the work, you can start at the psychological level and just think about how helpful it can be to get free of our patterns or habits that don't serve us in relationships to ourselves, to partners if we have them, in whatever context we live our vocational life, parents. So I appreciate that as well. It's an inviting or open invitation to those that are sincere in wanting to know more about who they are.
And this what made me think when we talk about identity, specifically, there's this idea in the work about self-remembering, and it's something that anybody that feels has this magnetic center that's drawn to these ideas. It doesn't require you to have any specific belief, but you do have to somehow recognize that there is this deeper you, that every day we fall asleep and forget ourselves, and then there's this charge to remember ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And it's not remembering what I could write down and present to you about who I am.
That's a great point. Yeah.
It's remembering in the cellular connection to my own conscious presence, and not being hooked on, not allowing my attention to be hooked and taken for a ride, not to lose my connection to my own sense of integrity that is a wordless thing, but or my own I'll use this language of gnosis, the things that I know that I know that I know that I may not be able to give verbal language to, but it's a knowing that lives and resonates in what the work describes as the harmonization of our three centers of intelligence. So in my gut, in my moving center, in my deeper heart, which is different than or emotional center, which is different than my reactivity, and then that kind of great spacious stillness of presence of mind. When those things line up, you've got a human being that's actually here. And Jesus said, be in the world but not of it. One of my friends and teachers has said, most of us are totally of the world but not in it. So the work is kind of, in one way to think about it, Cynthia would say it could be an early run-up on what we nowadays call mindfulness, but I like to think of it as a science of presence. We all want to be present, and one aspect of the work is that there is a science to teaching us how.
Yeah. Presence is such a powerful concept, and I love. Well, you gave this as a beautiful illustration, but we have these things in our pockets that draw our presence away so frequently, and for me personally, the first step in presence is putting this down, and really uh, what you said about mindfulness as well is that the presence that we bring to other people, the more aware that we are of other people, the more aware that of their difficulties, and that we ourselves share the same difficulties. I think the presence naturally leads to a compassion for others.
And for ourselves, that to really have a sincere spiritual practice and journey in a culture where most of us are not monastic, um, or involved living in a monastic setting, that we have a lot of distractions.
So that presence, it starts with yourself, being present with yourself. You mentioned it before, Jung's ideas of I guess you could call it shadow work. That, every day I'm going to sit, and this is coming to meditation. Every day I'm going to sit in silence, and some of the things that maybe come up for me can be uncomfortable, but yet that presence, cultivating a presence with others, it all starts with me cultivating presence in myself.
Yeah, so it does, and that's where the recipe that you're describing, I guess, in this podcast, and that you've just named, of the work of self-observation, not identifying with the stuff that can come up that maybe is accelerated with a meditation practice. So the work in meditation, that we can then learn to let it go and then come back to ourselves, self-remember, in our three centers of intelligence, that really allows us to live we don't even have to use religious language at all, but we could say a well-lived life of really, as you said, considering others, living out the law of that's at the core of all of our religious traditions, of do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
And that same presence that we cultivate in ourselves, we know that it's not only possible for me, you, but for everybody. And the reason is, I think that this is, the core of self-remembering, is that there is the divine that resides in all human hearts. We are or you can say, we don't know whether it's there or not, but it's better to assume that it is, and because it's not for us to really make that determination, and who is, we're all equally beggars when we come to the work. That's a fundamental idea of the work and Christianity. If you really get down to it, all have sinned and fallen short of glory of God, the grace that is absolutely necessary. But I think that's really I'm rambling a little bit. I'm trying to make the point that that the work really is this idea about with self-remembering, and the idea that the divine resides in the heart of each man, every man.
Yeah, and experientially, meditation was the pathway for me to get in touch with that. Now, I wanted to do meditation at first to feel better, and it didn't. There's other forms of meditation that could help regulate the nervous system in a different kind of way, but the practice of centering prayer specifically kind of really brings some of that stuff from the unconscious that's unprocessed to the fore. But if you stick with that practice long enough, you then also, there's this kind of infinite goodness that's also in the unconscious that you begin to get in touch with, that Father Keating would say, it's a quantum leap in the spiritual journey when you know your own goodness. And the Christian path is meant to lead to an embodiment of love, to become love. And we live with such a gap of hypocrisy if we pursue a Christian path, because we realize I'm not that, which is part of the invitation to come back to the paradox and mystery of being both unconditionally loved and being called to, through that experience of knowing I'm unconditionally loved, to embody it, to become an expression in this incarnation, in this form of that love for others, for myself too. So after a consistent and persistent discipline practice, I could then begin to taste in my own experience that pearl of great price, to use a gospel metaphor, that I am what I've been looking for. And in some ways, then seeking stops being such a desperate thing. It's like, wow, look what's here. And what a gift.
Yeah, recognizing that, I guess sometimes you can be your own worst enemy. I think, the non-criticality of the self-observation is so useful to me, because I can really beat myself up on when I make the failing, when I get mad and somebody cuts me off in traffic. I recognize, hey, that was a little bit of an overreaction, but instead of just recognizing that that's one aspect of who I am, but I don't have to identify with it, I kind of, I want to beat myself up. I want to say, gosh, you jerk, why, you're supposed to be this mature Christian guy, and yet you still get irritated at people cutting you off in traffic. And so I condemn myself rather than just recognize that that's an I in me that I don't have to identify with. But then there is this antidote, again, of self-observation without self-remembering is useless. And so the coming back to the self-remembering, finding that I think it's a challenging idea for some Christians too, to think or to believe in fundamental goodness of who we are. And I bet you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's actually part of the way that we've inherited our modern forms, wineskins of the exoteric version of Christianity, is, I think, can exasperate the inner critic. Father Keating would say, God wants us to be God, but to be God on God's terms, which means powerlessness in our connection. This is where the wisdom of recovery communities comes in. In 12 steps, the only step you have to get perfect is the first step, which is to admit complete unmanageability and powerlessness over whatever your thing is. So when you hear someone say, I'm a grateful alcoholic, it's because they realize that's what's got them into the door of the experience of divine assistance. And keeping their hands on that powerlessness is the thing that sets them up to receive what we would call in the work higher help. So there's a humility that we, again, we'll just land in a land of paradox. But yeah, I do know what you mean.
Well, and it's funny because when I started reading about the work in 2022, one of the first books I read was In Search of the Miraculous. And the thing that struck me the most was when it gets to the point in the story where Ouspensky's talking to Gurdjieff, and Gurdjieff tells him, man cannot do, that we're incapable of doing anything. And I think that when you get into conversations about, the inherent goodness of man, or where there are maybe there's a chosen few, Calvinist idea, fundamentally what we're admitting, at the outset, is that we are incapable of saving ourselves, and we must have this assistance from a higher power. And so I think that's a point that's really useful to be made, because some Christians maybe hear about fundamental goodness and they think, oh, well, this is a works-based doctrine that you're going to save yourself by following a book of rules, and we all know that that's impossible.
Yeah, even in Genesis, a reading of that myth, which is beautiful, is an affirmation of the goodness of creation, and especially of humanity, made in the image of the divine. And that's part of what a way we can approach the work from the standpoint of how personality gets overlaid on that essence of goodness. And part of the invitation in the work is to reverse that polarity. Instead of allowing the mask of our personality to, be what we're identified with, we observe that no, that's not. And that as we get more in touch with our essence, we allow that to drive the vehicle of our experience. In some ways, it reverses the polarity of our mind and our heart. Our intellectual center then kind of follows a grounded heart of knowing, of courage, which is the root of the meaning of heart, if you do the etymology on that word.
I love that. And, it has special meaning for me. My weakest center is my emotional, for sure. And I've just been so blessed because of the centering prayer and knowing that it's purifying that emotional center in me. It's making a huge difference in my life. Well, Jonathan, we're about at the 30-minute mark, and we want to be respectful of our audience members. Is there anything that we wanted to make sure that we covered before we sign off? And for sure, you've got a standing invitation to come back. If we continue this project, I'd for sure love to do another episode. But yeah, any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with, Jonathan?
Well, yeah, I'll leave us with that comment of we. You received me into the community, I think, before it was official. I think we met when there was still a process going on. And it just brings up, I think, a lot of people are hungry. A lot of people are seeking. There's a lot of information. Someone may access this conversation. And Gurdjieff said it's not difficult to do this work without a group. It's impossible. And there is something that we access in a collective with a shared intention in community that we could not get access to alone. The parts, the sum is greater than the sum of the parts. There's a multiplication effect in the exchange of sincerity. And so hopefully as you continue to have these conversations with people, they feel a part of that. But to really get into a community, it doesn't have to obviously be the community that we're blessed to be in. But there is a risking of yourself that includes part of putting teeth on your prayer, I would say, of being vulnerable to share what is most true with someone else. And that's the beginning.
Yeah, there's a reason that Jesus emphasized the church so much, isn't there?
Could you say that again?
Well, there's a reason why Jesus emphasized the church, because he recognized that we need one another, that there's no Lone Ranger Christians, that the idea of community is really necessary. And the work really facilitates that by giving us this common language.
Indeed.
Well, Jonathan, thanks so much for participating in this conversation, and we can sign off here. Everybody, thanks for tuning in, and if you like this video, you can hit the like button and subscribe to the channel and tell your friends about it. And we'll see you next time on the next episode of The Work and Meditation. God bless everybody. Have a good evening.